His uncle Eldon tied off his wrist to stop the bleeding. The spear had slipped right between the finger and the knuckle, cutting it in a way that there was very little bone splintering. Had there been any more splintering, or had the bone itself been cut, his finger would have been lost. He gave Josh a potion made from ale fumes, poppy seeds, and some things Josh couldn't pronounce that put him into a deep sleep for the procedure. It was thick and gritty. It burned in his mouth and down his throat, and it tasted horrid. Before long he found himself in a dream. He was surrounded by wolves standing like men, with spears in their hands. They stabbed him over and over, the metal tips sliding in and out of his body, the scrape of the rough wood inside the wounds as they shoved it in deeper. He tried to fight back. He tried to punch them and shove them away, but his arms were not long enough, and his blows hit too softly. His brother was there staring, watching them torture him. He tried to call out, "Brandon, help me!" but the words stayed in his throat. A black shadow with forest green eyes came up behind Brandon and opened his throat, and a river of blood flooded the area, and Josh was drowning. He awoke to his uncle searing his finger with a hot iron rod. He couldn't feel the heat. He groaned, but no words came out. He couldn't move his body, and he could barely breathe. He tried to slow his heart and calm himself, but panic took him, and he tried to thrash in his bed. He couldn't. He gained control of his fingers just as his uncle had finished applying the herbs and ale fumes to his finger. He stared at his uncle, unblinking, as his entire hand was wrapped in white bandages. Then feeling returned to his hand. He wished it hadn't. The feeling made him want to guzzle more potion and return to the nightmare. When he was a boy, he had fallen headfirst onto a nail that opened up his head, and he had fallen from a roof and cut down the entire length of his forearm. The ale fumes his uncle poured on them burned, but they only hurt a little after that. This pain was something different. Those other wounds were bigger, weren't they? Why did this one hurt so badly? He was able to exhale a long and agonizing groan. Groaning made the pain stop. Uncle Eldon returned with another potion. "This will soothe the pain. Here, drink." His uncle poured the potion into his mouth. It was thick and ran slowly. Josh closed his lips and half of it poured onto his face, but his uncle scooped it back into the cup and pried his lips open. This potion tasted even worse than the last one. It was gritty, bitter and salty. "Have water to be rid of the taste." The water was welcome, but it ran too fast and he breathed some in, and he began to choke. He was able to walk later that day, but his head was cloudy and he needed a stick to hold in his good hand to make sure he didn't fall. His hand ached and throbbed, but he couldn't feel the severed finger. He went to the long hall where Brandon and Teddy Brown the blacksmith and master-at-arms were. "Josh, I'm glad to see you well," said Brandon. "Well? I look well? I'm doing as well as I can for someone who had his whole finger cut off," he shouted, which was his usual voice. "I am also making do with my broken ribs, Josh. Teddy and I are trying to plan a counter-strike on Wolfsweald. You can help." "It's not my bloody job to help. You're the heir." But Josh had as much faith in Brandon to plan an attack as he trusted one-armed Hard Al to braid a rope. "Well, as far as I'm concerned, you have no business planning any kind of attack without Father's consent. If I remember, he's still alive, which means he's still Lord of Larksvale." His finger throbbed. Teddy Brown, with his broad, hairy chest and mustache that was so big it came off of his face and was almost a beard, spoke. "If we do nothing, they may lay siege to less guarded towns. I believe setting men at Timberbank, Old Horgrave, and Gildencarden would put us in an advantageous position. Fortifying our southern towns will guard our people for now." Josh pulled out a chair, carelessly grabbing it with his bad hand. He almost let out a yelp, but he wasn't going to let Brandon see him wince. "That is all well, but," he sat, "we need to be ready and prepare a counter-strike. Weakness must never be seen in us. And you won't see it in me, Brandon." Brandon stroked his chin. "I don't think that's a good idea. I think we need to guard the towns, but I don't think sending out a bunch of our men to die with no plan sounds that great." "Brandon, that's what we're doing here. We're planning. That's what these meetings are for," he said, staring at Brandon, unblinking. His hand throbbed. Brandon played with something between his fingers. "I don't know. I want to hear from someone who's been in battle. Send for Jordan." "What?" Jordan was a bastard. He had no right to be in the council room. He was the product of a night of reveling long ago, made in dishonor. The fact that he existed at all was a shame, a blight on the Purrington name. Of course Brandon would do this. Brandon had all the rights, but no brains and no skill. He was clumsy, ignorant, impudent, stupid, and rash. Josh had the brains. He had the skill. He had everything it took to be the Lord of Larksvale, but he had been born too late. He would be forced to have his stupid, nose-picking older brother as his lord for his whole life. And Brandon was showing his stupidity again by bringing a bastard into the long hall. Jordan walked in the room wearing a blue jerkin, and his dark hair was falling into his dark eyes. "You called for me, brother?" Josh jerked his head right at him. "You are to call him my lord in the long hall, Jordan." "Call me brother," said Brandon, much to Josh's grief. "I need your counsel. Should we launch a counter-strike on Wolfsfield?" Jordan hung his head. I'm not sure. I've been in 2 battles with heavy casualties in the last few weeks. I'm not in a rush to return to battle, or to risk more of our men." "That's because you're a valorless coward, and they talk about giving you knighthood?" Josh balked. Running from a fight was the worst thing a man could do. In the 7 holds, even so much as dodging was an admission of weakness and cowardice. Not wanting to fight a battle that needed to be fought was just as bad. "He has more valor and has won more battles in the last week than you have your entire life, Joshua, and I won't let you cut him off again." "You were saying, Jordan? About our men?" said Brandon, leaning forward. "How dare he talk to me like this, like I'm some commoner? I am a lord of sorts in my own right, and I killed more people than you in the courtyard, you stupid fool." His hand throbbed. Jordan continued. "They aren't just numbers to be thrown against other numbers. There are people." "And a lord's duty is to his people," said Brandon, quoting his father. "Thank you, Jordan. That's exactly what I was thinking." Of course he agrees with the witless bastard. "Brandon, if we don't strike now, they'll strike us again, and more people will die. We need to take action. If I recall, Joshua, you were the one who was saying we can't do anything without our Lord Father's consent." Brandon turned his head away from Josh. "Master Teddy, set 50 extra men at each of the southern towns. Double the watch here at the keep. Tell our men to keep their eyes and their swords sharp." What a daft statement. He already thinks he's in charge. "We don't have the men for that, Brandon." "Every man in Larksvale learns the longsword." "We have the men," said Brandon, gesturing with his hands. The longsword. Josh hadn't even thought about it until now. How would he fight with his hand like this? The swords they used were 2-handed, but he only had one useful hand. He wasn't going to be doing any fighting for a long time. Is that why Brandon was talking to him like this? Was it because he knew that no harm would come to him? That made Josh angry. His hand throbbed. "You think we can get them all to stop harvesting? What are they going to eat?" "This is your problem, Brandon. You don't think," he said, pointing at his head. "I think they won't be able to eat if they have a spear in their gut and wolves tearing out their throats. We don't know what those barbarians have been doing down in the Evergreens all these years. They could have a legion of wolves at their command, or strange magic to use. We need to defend ourselves. Besides, How are we going to get men to go on a counterstrike? Wouldn't they have to stop harvesting as well? Brandon was too stupid to realize what Josh was saying. Where's Uncle Eldon? The keep wizard should be here, shouldn't he? You brought him in, he said, gesturing at Jordan. Uncle is tending to the wounds of our men. You weren't the only one to suffer injury. Brandon stared right at Joshua, his voice full of intention. Josh stood, his chair falling behind him, making a clack that rang through the long hall. You will regret talking to me like that, Brandon. He stared right at Brandon, and his face reddened. The veins in his neck began to show, and Brandon met his gaze. Brandon had the right of it, he knew. Why am I even arguing for it? Perhaps Uncle's potion had clouded his head more than he thought, or maybe he was weary from battle. In his heart, he knew exactly why. Counter-striking was a bad idea, but it was the option Brandon disliked. He turned and walked out of the long hall, but not before having the last word. I see you don't need me here. You have the blacksmith and a bastard here to make all of your decisions for you. His hand throbbed. Welcome to the Storytime Saturday podcast. My name is TGD, your host. Now this is one of our shorter chapters. It's only 1,800 words. This is probably the shortest chapter so far. I kind of enjoy these short chapters. They're very digestible. They're similar in length to the Mandy series that I have posted, the audiobook, and you could also find those on Wattpad, link in the description. So let's start with the writing aspect. Some of the usual stuff, some formatting, grammar, and punctuation that's not correct. That's going to be in the whole thing. So there is some muddied description. The most that points out, like what sticks out to me, is how muddy this description of Teddy Brown is. Teddy Brown with his broad, hairy chest and mustache that was so big it came off of his face and was almost a beard. That is not concise. Maybe it paints the picture for you. Not easy to read. You kind of have to move your eyes and go over it a few times to really see what it says. So let's talk about the characters. Now this is from the point of view of Josh. Josh just got his finger reattached. Surgery performed by the wizard, his uncle Eldon. So some character things I want to point out about Josh. We see Josh concerned with how Brandon views him when he goes into the long hall. He's constantly mentioning how he refuses to let Brandon see him weak. We get a little bit of a hint as to why Josh acts the way he does. Now, with him, there's some stereotypical younger brother, younger lord jealousy that he views Brandon as stupid, and Josh is the one that has the brains and the skill, and he's the one that deserves it, but Brandon was born first. But it goes deeper than the stereotypical jealous second son. We see that he has a high view of honor and bravery, which is part of why he dislikes Jordan, because Jordan's simple existence is a dishonor. And his argument with Brandon against not retaliating against Wolfswield, that's cowardice. So every decision Brandon is making is grating against Josh's core values of honor and bravery. Josh also displays good critical thinking here. Counter-Strike would take less men than doubling the watch and pulling farmers away from harvesting for guard duty, which would be detrimental to the entire economy to stop farming, especially in the middle of war. They're really facing a war on two fronts. There's a war in the north, to the north of them in Mifflin, and a war to the south of them in Wolfswield. So there's men in the north fighting, and you're drawing more people away to double the watch at the keep instead of doing what you have to do. I don't want to say that we're seeing logic versus emotion here, because Josh is also making emotional decisions. So these are knee-jerk reactions from Josh based on his core values, which are honor and courage. In addition to logic, in contrast to Brandon, but we'll talk more about Brandon later. So in the end, Josh ends up doubting his decision. His internal monologue he's saying, why am I even arguing for this? He starts to disagree with his own position. But that's actually, as we'll see in continuing chapters with Josh, this is the position that he actually keeps. This is a major argument between Josh and Brandon. Their rivalry is between being offensive and being defensive. That's the crux of their arguments in the coming chapters. So he mentions that he's like kind of drugged up. So he's like, maybe I'm thinking cloudy because I'm on the drugs. But as it turns out, like, the doubt is cloudiness from the drugs. So of course I have to point out that this Josh is not like Josh in real life. Now, Josh in real life may not be the angriest brother. That might go to a different brother. I'm not sure. But definitely he has been the most vocally angry brother. There's very little that, I mean, from my perspective, from an outside perspective, Josh usually speaks his mind. Josh is usually one to speak his mind. But that's something we actually see in this chapter, is that Book Josh is showing restraint. That he doesn't actually say everything that he's thinking. He only says about 70% of what he's actually thinking. And that might be what Josh in real life is like, I don't know. And that's always what people... I'm not saying, if you're listening, Josh, I'm not saying this is you, but people that are loudmouths in real life are the people that are like, oh, you don't like what I'm saying? If only I said everything I was thinking. If only I said everything I was thinking. Well, maybe you need to dial it back a little bit. So maybe that's a bit of the inspiration there. Those people always say that. People that are a loudmouth. You're like, maybe you should keep some of your opinions to yourself. Oh, if you only knew half of what I was thinking. Yeah, I wish we knew less than half. Of course, not a rib on the real life Josh. But the real life Josh is someone that, that's part of what you could respect about him, is that he does say what he's thinking. There's not really ever a time where you're questioning what's going on in his head. But Josh, around the time I wrote this, four years ago, Josh was vocally the most angry brother, and he has mellowed out over the years. Probably, life changes and maturity and whatnot that mellowed him out. So let's talk about Brandon in this chapter. Brandon looks a lot different when we're looking at him through Josh's eyes, since this chapter's through Josh's perspective. He's a lot snarkier. He's a lot more bold, and Josh has some questions as to why that is later on, of course. But he is... I like playing with the perspective that since you're looking through a different character's eyes, you'll see different characters in a different light. Now, Josh describes Brandon as his stupid, nose-picking older brother, and of course that has no correlation to the real world. No correlation to the real Brandon at all, of course not. But we do see Brandon standing up to Josh in this chapter a lot. Josh in the chapter assumes that's because of his injured hand that Josh can't do anything since he's severely injured, that Josh wouldn't advance against Brandon. And Uncle Eldon's in the chapter, and we see that, yeah, again, wizards are really just maesters from Game of Thrones. Like the medieval doctors in a lot of ways. Now, speaking of being derivative of Game of Thrones, Josh is given poppy seeds and ale fumes. Ale fumes means moonshine. It's moonshine that he has, or a vodka. It's like a distilled spirit he has. He's given poppy seeds and moonshine to knock him out. Now, milk of the poppy, of course, is a very popular drug in the Game of Thrones universe. So that's pretty much just a copy and paste from Game of Thrones. I just call it poppy seeds and ale fumes instead of milk of the poppy. But that's actually something that's actually one of the things I like the most. And it's something I like about The Witcher as well, even though like it's not as detailed from what I've read. But I like the idea that medieval scholars have a rudimentary understanding of pharmacology, and that they would end up making something like the cough syrup that had... I don't know if you've ever seen that. There's an image of cough syrup from 100 years ago, and it's lists the ingredients: alcohol, cannabis, chloroform. I think that's kind of funny that they're using this stuff they don't quite have an understanding of the effects. Because we'll look at that and say, oh, wow, they're using chloroform just casually. And I'm pretty sure heroin just used to be an over-the-counter drug. So I like that there's a rudimentary understanding of pharmacology in the medieval world, that they are using things that they kind of don't have a great understanding of, but they know it works. And they come up with like this mystical name for it, like milk of the poppy or something, some potions that they come up with. But yes, it is derivative from Game of Thrones. And I also think every potion in Game of Thrones is described as gritty as well. So yeah, again, just a copy-paste. Now, I do want to point out Joss's dream that he has when he's under the influence of the drugs. That's not prophetic in any way. It really doesn't mean anything. The drugs are just giving him nightmares. And maybe I when I was researching, I found like an anesthetic, an ancient knockout potion that they used that would make someone pass out and that they'd have nightmares. I didn't really give enough hints that that's what was happening, if that's what happened. Because I know that I definitely, when I was writing this, 20% of the time was spent on writing, and 80% was spent on research. Like, okay, well, what kind of effects do these leaves have? And so that's what's happening there. Yeah, the dream is not prophetic. He's literally just having a nightmare from the drugs. And that's actually a very important plot point, that the drugs give him nightmares. But the nightmares do display some things that happened in his life and some internal fears. If you remember back in Brandon's chapter, I do believe, I don't remember if it was Brandon or if it was Jordan who mentioned that his two youngest brothers were dead, and there was another brother that was banished. So there's a shadow with forest green eyes. We know the Purrington clan has forest green eyes, and it comes up behind Brandon and opens his throat. So, as frustrated as Josh gets with Brandon, he actually is afraid for his life. He doesn't want Brandon to die. He's horrified at the thought of Brandon dying, just like his other brothers did. With a shadow with forest green eyes killing his brother. That's what he has a nightmare about. And lastly, I want to point out when Josh is talking about how bad the pain is, I mentioned when he was a boy, he had fallen headfirst onto a nail that opened up his head, and he had fallen from a roof and cut down the entire length of his forearm. This actually happened. Fun fact, that actually happened to the real life Josh. The real life Josh fell off of a table or something and cut his head right open on the nail. And he fell off a roof, and I remember coming over his house, and there was a big gash right down his arm. I'm like, whoa, what happened there? He goes, I fell off a roof. And that's something that I like about Josh, too, is that the real life Josh really undersells himself in a lot of ways. In contrast to some other brothers, the other brothers will be sitting around talking about the awesome and amazing things they did when they were playing dodgeball, and I'll be sitting there. I said, "Yeah, I don't have any stories of triumph or anything." And Josh will look at me and go, "Don't worry, I don't either." But that's pretty extreme. Falling off of a roof. Falling off of a roof is something that actually happened to him. So he kind of undersells how extreme he actually is, which is something that I like about him. Humility is always a very attractive trait to me, someone who's humble. But that about wraps it up for this chapter. Next week, we will see the start of the tournament arc with Sir Jacob. The tournament arc starts. And Sir Jacob, as far as we know right now in the story, he is easily the strongest character in the verse. Sir Jacob is the strongest character in the verse as of right now. So seeing some things from his perspective will be fun, I think. And I think Sir Jacob was one of my favorite characters. So come back next week and check it out. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like the video and make sure you're subscribed. I'm not sure if I'm actually posting this anywhere else. But if I am, make sure you follow and like or whatever on those other platforms. And I will see you next week. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for being here with me on the Storytime Saturday podcast. It's always a joy to have you here with me.